Welcome back to another episode of Buying Sandlot. On today's episode, we have IMG Academy's college placement numbers. Massachusetts Lawmakers has some thoughts on youth sports and a new survey that covers youth sports participation costs, public opinions, and more. But before we get into that, we want to thank our sponsor here, Black Magic. Black Magic, recently every kick, phase, scrum, and try at this year's Tropical Sevens Youth Rugby Tournament was streamed thanks to Black Magic Design. That included 250 plus teams and 750 plus matches across 15 fields over 4 days of frenetic action streamed live in its entirety at a level not previously seen in the sport. That included their mini extreme and mini pro switchers and their replay and post-production solutions. Everyone who watches youth sports, you know this, athletes, parents, and grandparents, coaches, college recruiters, they've all come to expect streaming that looks and sounds professional. So if this sounds like something you would like, and you would like to deliver this for your club, event, facility, or school, their suite of affordable products are the same high quality as those used by professional sports teams and in Hollywood, delivering easy-to-learn multicam streaming that open new revenue streams. You can go to Black Magic Design for more information. The Associated Press and Ipsos released a new report that covered a lot of bases: participation, benefits, motivation, costs, challenges, and public opinions on key talking points. The AP story on the survey led with the cost participation headline. About 70% of K-12 parents with a household income of $100,000 or more have kids participating, compared to about 40% of parents with a lower household income. 54% of adults surveyed said they played youth sports, and 65% of youth sports parents played. 68% of youth sports parents are spending $2K or less on their kids' activities, and 89% are at $5K or less. That's where I'll stop it there, Kyle. What'd you think of that survey report?
Yeah, so interesting stuff. I think the two data points you just read largely point to things that we've seen in Project Play data and other, sort of publicly available data. This is from last Friday in the newsletter. If anyone's looking, it's titled "New Youth Sports Survey" in your inbox, 814. But it was the last three that actually stood out to me. So in order, 68% of sports parents are spending less than $2,000 on their kids' sports, and 89% are spending less than $5,000. So this just speaks to the fact that the averages that we see of this $1,000 cost for youth sports parents is drugged up by the high end of spending, and there's lots of outliers out there. So I think it's just another data point there. Next, you kind of have James turned it. The survey also found the demise of community and recreational sports has been greatly exaggerated. 72% of parents say their kids have participated in rec sports, 64% on a school team, only 40% on club or travel, right? So I think this narrative that's out there that rec doesn't exist anymore is simply not true, right? There may be more pressure to play club, more travel teams, more volume of participation on those more competitive teams, but rec still exists in spades. And the last one, I found this interesting, and I actually put a screenshot of the data in the newsletter. The survey found 42% of adults would support a law banning private equity in youth sports. So less than half of people, but close enough to half, compared to 26% who oppose it and 31% who are not sure. Okay, fine. But the opposition of the law, not of private equity, of the law banning private equity, was higher, slightly, 30%, amongst youth sports parents, while support for it was flat. So what this tells me is that, even if only slightly, the average adult is more opposed to private equity in youth sports than youth sports parents who are actually seeing it firsthand, right? And I think if you kind of look at a lot of the detractors on the professionalized side of youth sports, and the loudest, vocalist minority of those folks, just, by taking some educated guesses here, don't appear to be the parents of current youth sports athletes, right? And I think we see, so I think it's important to consider the fact that youth sports parents, according to the survey, are actually slightly more in favor of private equity involvement. And I continue to think that most parents, simply don't care if their child's sports program is nonprofit or for-profit, owned by private equity or not, part of a large platform or not. At the end of the day, what they really care about is it well run? And for whatever I'm spending, am I getting value and not being nickel and dimed and rip off, right? And about a third of parents are unsure as to whether they're for or against private equity. And to me, that represents an opportunity for the industry to explain the benefits of professionalization or for-profit entities, whether that's safety, whether that's things like we talked about at the top of the show, not getting missed, like just like little, sort of crossing of the T's and dotting of the I's, or whether it's just wholesale, potentially fraud in the case of one of those regional Little League tournaments that was volunteer led. So I think there's an education opportunity here, because it turns out the majority of parents aren't, kind of against private capital in youth sports. And I think that data sometimes gets lost in all the headlines we continue to see.
I think that leads us into our next topic perfectly. Massachusetts lawmakers, they've got some thoughts on youth sports. A working group of Massachusetts lawmakers published a report with 11 recommendations to address challenges in the youth sports industry. It says is at a crossroads. A couple notable ones. A new state agency in Massachusetts would oversee youth sports with potential regulatory powers over the length and timing of seasons. State licensing for coaches and officials, minimum certifications, training standards, and disciplinary processes. A state code of conduct for organizations. A minimum 90-day jail sentence for assault of coaches or officials. Establishment of public youth sports grant program. Facilities orgs would be required to allow recording of all youth sports events. You might remember Barry Feingold's bill we talked about a couple months ago. This is different. This isn't a bill yet. This is also just recommendations and stuff. I'll start first here. I think using the word crossroads is pretty subjective here. You just mentioned it. I don't think youth sports is at a crossroads personally. I think if you have a good experience with youth sports, you would enjoy it. You have a bad experience with youth sports, you hate it. You don't have a kid in youth sports. You read some of the headlines in Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. You probably think it's out of control. Personally, I don't think the government should be involved in youth sports other than from a funding mechanism, from a safety and compliance mechanism. Too much regulation, I think, does push the pendulum far one way. And I think most of these recommendations probably could be batted back if the bill does materialize into anything they get. If people understand the industry in those hearings, mark this up similarly to what we kind of talk about with like Kids Play Act.
No, I mean, some of these are good, right? State licensing, certification or training standards. Some of these like compliance things I think are good. Probably better at a federal level, right? At a state by state level, although probably great opportunity for us to put together a bill tracker and a law tracker, right? I mean, because it's going to be a headache if this were to, these sorts of regulations were to roll out on a state by state basis. But I agree with you on the crossroads thing. You talk to parents, and I think most parents agree, like, oh my God, this is crazy. But then you also talk to those same parents, and they'll be like, you know what? I'm just glad my kid's out of the house and not sitting on their screen and not on Instagram or TikTok. And, they'll lament the costs, but at the same time, like, the kids, generally speaking, want to play, right? Like they're asking to go play. And so I think, there are a lot of this, I think, comes down to parent education. I think, right, the biggest problem with abuse of coaches and officials, this is from parents. This has nothing to do with the professionalization, right? This is whether it's volunteer or for profit, it doesn't matter. You're going to have parents on the sidelines yelling at coaches. You're going to have, I would argue that the volunteer coaches on the whole, not individually, but on the whole, are probably harder on kids, especially their own kids, than the professional coaches. The vast majority of club runners, tournament organizers, coaches that we've come across in the last year and a half that are on the for-profit side of the business are thoughtful. It's their job. They're trained, right? They're used to dealing with athletes. And they generally, I'll look at, when my kids go to like a for-profit camp or something like that, and I say, wow, like these coaches are really good and patient with the kids. Whereas like as a volunteer dad, after about 15 minutes on a Sunday morning practice with 8-year-olds, like I'm pulling my hair out, right? So I think, a lot of the problems are not just, because of the professionalization side, I guess, which is a dead horse that I continue to beat here. But yeah, I think a lot of these things are, timing of seasons, length and timing of seasons. You know what? Like you could argue that, we shouldn't play 9 months a year of baseball, but if you want to play 9 months a year, like someone, like you can't stop, but this is America. Like go play baseball. It's fine.
There's a lot worse things that kid could be doing than playing 9 months of baseball. And then it's like, the kid plays baseball. If he goes home and plays wiffle ball, is that part of the hours you now have to log? What if he plays at a state tournament and stuff? Do you have to log those hours and stuff? So I think you're right with the federal level stuff and everything. The state certification and training standards, we talk about the portable passport all the time for a coach. There's no reason a coach who wants to coach baseball, basketball, soccer should have to get three background checks. Same thing with an official. Like if we could just get that coach passport, I think that would solve a lot of issues. On the other side, though, the disciplinary board, like I think James wrote this in the newsletter. There's a thin line. Coach starts arguing with balls and strikes on an ump. Things get a little feisty. Now that coach is in front of a disciplinary board and he might get his coaching license revoked when we don't have coaches already in this country and we have kind of a lag on that. So, I mean, if you want to make sports more accessible and more affordable, I'm right there with you. When we start introducing disciplinary boards, minimum jail sentences, and telling a kid when he can and can't play basketball, you lose me a little bit there.
I totally agree. We have laws for a reason, right? It is illegal to assault a coach or an official or anybody, right? And there are jail. I don't think you can apply the law differently because someone was a coach. You shouldn't assault a coach or an official. Let me just say that, right? But there is a law that prevents you from doing that and has consequences for that. So I think stating those consequences explicitly just because it happens to be a certain role in society, I mean, that's a slippery slope that's never going to work. But we have laws on the books to prevent these things, right? You can't legislate people from being a-holes sometimes, right? I mean, it's true.
That's a good quote. It's a good quote.
So, and I think like the facility orgs required to allow recording of all youth events, again, like there's some nuance here. I've yet to see someone who said they can't record a video of their kid playing. What we have seen is that people have restricted live, wide scale, live broadcast and streaming. And particularly like Perfect Game, we had Rob on talk about when they brought that influencer in. Like they were streaming it on YouTube live from outside the gates. And they're like, hey, listen, stop that. We'll bring you in, create content with us, but you can't, this is our IP. So, again, I think some of this stuff is just the narrative has taken over now and it's impacting lots of bad ideas at the state and federal level. And you mentioned it with the passports. I do think our friends Zarif over at the Good Game, I mean, they're sitting in a good spot here because some states are going to pass some of this stuff and you're going to need something that looks like a passport that you can go state by state and saying, yep, I got my background check. Yep, I'm good. So I'm bullish on that side of the space. I'm bullish on media outlets covering the state by state rollout of regulation. Good little beat for us to be in, but I think a net negative, generally speaking.
Yep, last one, IMG Academy. They just released their college placement numbers. And let's just say this shows why parents and athletes choose to go to school there. We did just have Mike Milliron on Thursday. That's in the podcast feed or on YouTube. So go listen to that if you haven't yet. Major takeaway was about 7% of high school athletes go on to play college sports. IMG Academy, on the other hand, is sending about 70% to college to play sports, according to that recently released data on its class of 2026. Now, obviously, IMG Academy, when the kids who are going to this school, they are, very focused, very sports-oriented and stuff. So these numbers should be high. I don't know if I thought they were going to be 10 times the national average high. What do you think about that, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Look, if you're spending $70,000 a year to go to IMG, you're probably a pretty good athlete. I know their academics are good, so I'm not particularly surprising, not representative of the whole. But some interesting things in there, particularly about the growth of women's volleyball. I like to look at these big platforms and entities like IMG, and when they talk about a particular sport and what they're seeing, I think there's some signal in that noise or some signal there. And so when they say like they've never seen anything like women's volleyball, girls volleyball, okay, it's not a shock to anybody, but also like it's sort of like it puts its stamp of approval on, yes, like there's a serious trend here. Because I think there's not a ton of operators or entities in youth sports that have the scale to really sort of definitively weigh in on something like that and the history that IMG has. So I definitely would pull that out of there. I would say in general, around sports academies, I think the average parent or person, these are pretty foreign concepts, right? You see a great elite athlete and you hear they went to a sports academy. You don't think about it. You're like, well, of course they did. They're, on the U.S. men's national team, or they're a professional hockey player. And you're like, well, that's not me. That's not 99% of kids. And then the first time we talked to, some of the Alpha School folks, the Texas Sports Academies, the San Diego's, the IMG, TPH, Spire, the first couple times we're in the weeds more than the average parent. I think the average parent would be surprised to learn how big the academy space is in general. They may think IMG or Spire and not much else. But I was at the Union match the other night and saw Kevin Sullivan, who's 16 and is going to be on the men's national team. And he went through the Union YSC Academy, which is now I assume a part of Capacity Sports Group bought up YSC. They have a good partnership with the union. And they play at their facility. And you're like, man, like there's a school there that I didn't even know existed, frankly, right? And I think the more we do this, the more I'm bullish on the kind of sports academy world in general. I think my initial thought was, wow, this is pretty like esoteric and not for 99.9% of people. And then I talked to the people involved and I'm like, wow, this is a lot more thoughtful. And there's a lot more about the academics and the whole of the person than just making somebody really good at sport. So I don't know, just generally speaking, I'm bullish on the IMGization of education, more athletics in education, more quality sort of academy, sports plus academics. We've talked about it here before, but yeah, that's a general view.
I think maybe not not my kids' generation, maybe in my kids' generation. I think sports academies will be democratized in a way. I think it'll be more localized. I think it'll be more, figuring out a way to kind of distribute that academy model more efficiently and at a maybe cheaper cost than it might be right now.
Yeah, I know we're almost on time. We get a hop, but I guess to put a bow on it. So if you look at just general school and education, it was kind of built for the last version of the world, right? It was about, it was built to produce people who go to work from 9 to 5 and punch a time clock like that. It was really the structure of school. If you kind of read about the structure of school, and some really good private schools are more thoughtful and progressive in how they're thinking about the world going forward. But frankly, no one knows what the world's going to look like in 20 or 30 years for the young kids now. And I continue to think athletics, athleticism, competition, sport, or will be one of the things that will be relevant regardless of what happens in the world. And so you could say, hey, like my kid's doing arts classes, or he's learning this, he's learning that. If knowledge becomes some amount of omnipresent in the world, right? Some of the stuff that I think traditional schools are set up for just won't apply in the future. And I could see this, I think is a major tailwind for sports academies, right? If you're doing your extracurriculars in music class or art, some people just might say, you know what, get rid of those. Let my kid play 2 hours of sports. That's more important to us as a family. And I could see that making more sense than, I think I originally thought. Anyway, big tailwind for the sports academy space, I believe.
Yeah, be interesting space to follow. Well, that is the episode for today. We appreciate everybody who listened. Enjoy your weekend. We will see you next week. GG's.